Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Lin, who is assistant professor in the Department of International Education here at VU. And he holds a PhD from Hong Kong University and was also a Fulbright scholar at Harvard University. Today he's going to present his latest book called Multiculturalism, Chinese Identity and Education. So let's all welcome our speaker.
And thank you everyone for coming to my presentation. And today the topic is about the multiculturalism, Chinese identity and education, Huawei. And this was based on one of the book that was published by Routledge last year. And the book was also with the same title. And I would like to clarify that because the book was published last year, so the data was collected back to 2 years ago. So I don't have any update data till now, but I have another project which will investigate the latest situation. So, but that is another story. So today, the presentation will be divided into 7 parts. Firstly, I will talk a little bit about how people are questioning Chinese identity in a multicultural world. And then I'll present a little bit about the context, especially the politics and textbooks in China and Hong Kong. And then I will summarize 3 major official approaches to Chinese identity in both China and Hong Kong. And I summarize them as ethnic essentialism, cultural assimilation, and nationalistic history. Then I will argue why a multicultural approach to Chinese identity is beneficial to the society and conclude with some final remarks. So if you go into the detail of the book, and you will see that Chinese identity, or some people call it national identity, is a controversial issue recently in both Hong Kong and China. So in this book, and also in this presentation, I would like to draw attention to some of the evidence that how the governments are kind of constructing Chinese identity. And that's what I call the official approach to Chinese identity. And I will focus on this part. So I will firstly give you some global background of this topic. You can see that the world has witnessed too many wars fueled by fear and hatred toward differences among people. Many people are divided by questionable social categories and partisans, and groups around the world often feel that their members are to some extent being attacked, bullied, persecuted, and discriminated against. Whether people admit it or not, and whether governments hide it or not, it is simply a fact that society is marked by diversity in terms of gender, social class, ethnicity, race, language, political ideology, citizenship status, etc. As current politics shows, the question of identity causes trouble everywhere. Many countries are debating how to understand diverse identities, especially national, ethnic, and cultural identity, because it relates to the fundamental question of who are we. And with increasing interaction and integration among people, institutions, organizations, and governments under waves of globalization and global migration, differences between groups are decreasing, while internal diversity within groups is increasing. And this doesn't just happen in societies that have previously had a large proportion of migrants and were built by immigrants, such as the US, Canada, and Australia. It also occurs in societies that have been traditionally seen as homogeneous, but have witnessed increasing migration in the last few decades, and that include in China, Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea. And this global context impacts the development and social reality of diverse identities and poses challenges and opportunities for governments to rethink and modify their current approaches for understanding identity in order to better accommodate all people. And from a broader and universal view, there is no unconditionally good or bad framework for understanding identity. Instead, it is a question of what framework better fits a specific context, how different frameworks are understood and applied in the context, and how they challenge or benefit diverse groups within society. So it is important to grasp the uniqueness of context and the particular forms that various frameworks could take in a context. And from a literature review, there is a research gap. For example, generally speaking, the global discourse on identity has a blind spot because it is basically focused on research that mainly conducted in Western societies, while other parts of the world, especially Asian perspective, are often neglected in the literature. So in my study, I focus on two Asian societies, China and Hong Kong, to explore their perspective on identity. And you can see that in both societies, Chinese identity is a key concept that connects different identities and is vital for responding to the question of who are we. For example, as the majority population in both societies is often called ethnic Han Chinese, predominant Chinese identity is promoted by governments as a norm, and ethnic minorities' identities are formed in contrast to it. In this context, the issues concerning ethnic minorities cannot be well understood without figuring out how Chinese identity is understood. At the same time, some people may think Chinese identity is a kind of a self-evident concept. But in this book, I argue that it is not a self-evident concept, neither it is a fully established concept. Instead, it is a constantly developing and complex concept. And given its intersections with politics, ethnicity, culture, history, etc., its meanings are different across occasions. And as mentioned before, this book will examine the Chinese and Hong Kong government's approaches to Chinese identity from 2013 to 2021, and examine how the latest modified versions of government-endorsed school textbooks published and available in this period support the government's overarching approaches. And the main reason why I chose this period was because the President Xi Jinping come into office in 2020 to 2012. And from then on, you can see the Chinese identity become a very important concept for its construction of the nation. So I think this is a very important period where you can see how Chinese identity is developed. And the next part would be about the context, especially the politics and textbook. And from literature, the relationship between politics, official understanding, and textbooks in general is very complex. One vital issue to understand their relationship is whose understanding is official. And you can see answers vary across contexts. In some contexts, the government controls information and the content of textbooks. In this context, only views expressed by the government through government documents and official speeches are considered official, and textbooks should support these official views. While in other contexts, various stakeholders, including government officials, textbook authors, curriculum experts, teachers, and other educators and parents, they vie for influencing the content of textbooks. And in this global debate on the relationship between politics, official understanding, and textbooks, there are three consensus appear. First, the government often plays an important role in defining official understanding and textbook production. Second, the textbook is one of the most crucial artifacts related to politics and official understanding. It produces and reinforces identity-related content that deserves critical examination. Lastly, textbooks do not just passively reflect what governments or stakeholders want, but have the potential to actively exert an influence on changing politics through counter-hegemony, empowering students, encouraging critical thinking, and providing diverse perspectives. So this book uses official in its narrow sense, which specifically refers to the understanding defined by the government. And as mentioned, there are other understanding of what official means. For example, every person has their understanding of what official understanding should be. So in this sense, this book lives out those understandings that are considered by people as official based on their own independent judgments. And I made this choice because I think it can better fit the context of China and Hong Kong, where the governments often hold power to define what is official. And about the situation in China, I summarize it as government control education and textbooks. Because in China, only information authorized by the government can be considered official. And the government position is often promoted in education resources as authoritative. And once changes in political leadership occurred, the content of educational resources will be updated and modified by curriculum designers and publishers to match the new position. At the same time, education policymakers, school leaders, teachers, and other educators also will refer to the government position for guidance. Since the 2017, there is a unified textbook system in public schools, especially for the 3 Chinese identity-related subjects: history, morality, and the rule of law, and moral and political education. This will be the focus where I collect data in the China's part. And in Hong Kong, I call it as education and government recommended textbooks. Because although similar to the situation in China, education in Hong Kong is connected to politics and largely influenced by the government. But unlike China, where the textbook is a compulsory component of the curriculum, schools in Hong Kong enjoy more freedom in terms of choosing educational resources. For example, they can choose textbooks published by different publishers, and they can use school-based curriculum, and they can use resources from news media, etc. However, the textbooks remains an important education resources in schools, and teachers often rely on it in most cases. And given that there are diverse publishers in Hong Kong, the content of their textbooks could vary. Although the government allows a certain degree of freedom for textbooks, the Educational Bureau conducts a textbook review for all compulsory subjects and some elective subjects. Textbooks can be submitted to it for review, and they will be assessed by a committee panel, and those reaching acceptable standards will be clarified as recommended and included on the recommended textbook list. And the review is mainly conducted in a voluntary form. Only publishers that hope their textbooks can be included on the list should submit their textbooks for review. And the list is on the government website and is recommended to schools and teachers. And there are 3, while I conducted the data, there were 3 Chinese identity related subjects: general studies in primary education and Chinese history and history in secondary education. And I know that these subjects, many of them will be replaced by other subjects in the next few years. So that's why I would conduct another research. So that's another story again. And the differences between China and Hong Kong influence the degree that which textbook reflect the government position. And in this book, I focus on textbooks that reflect the government position. Therefore, I examine the unified textbook in China for the 3 subjects that I just mentioned, and textbooks that are reviewed and recommended by the Hong Kong government on the list, and also for the 3 subjects. And then I will move to one of the major official approach to Chinese identity, which I call ethnic essentialism. And essentialism in general refers to a view that every entity has real and true essence that are necessary and sufficient for an entity to be what it is and distinguish it from other entities. Instead of just identifying and recognizing this essence, essentialism sees them as fixed and permanent. This book perceives ethnic essentialism as a branch of essentialism with a focus on ethnicity. So it interprets ethnicity in a primordial way as a fundamental and natural characteristic of identity with deep psychological and biological roots, which is fixed once it is constructed. And the term ethnicity in Chinese context is kind of an ambiguous concept, which contains biological, cultural, and ideological meaning. And the government often makes use of this ambiguity to serve its purpose. For example, sometimes the government uses ethnicity in ethnic and racial sense, suggesting that all Chinese ethnicities, here equivalent to ethnicity, belong to the same Chinese ethnicity, and here refers to race. This usage of ethnicity serves the purpose of making the notion of the national independence of Chinese ethnic minorities illegitimate. On another occasion, sometimes the government emphasizes cultural meanings of ethnicity that different Chinese ethnicities differ in culture, and Han culture is the most advanced. In this sense, in this book, I show that ethnicity is understood in Chinese context differently than in Western context, wherein race refers to biological and physical traits, which are heritable and hard, if not possible, to change, while ethnicity intersects more with cultural identification, which is learned and relatively easier to change. And to better analyze Chinese context, in this book, I use ethnicity as a broader concept that combines traditional meanings of race and ethnicity. Following this logic, ethnic essentialism refers to the understanding that Chinese identity has a permanent and unattainable ethnic essence. And this component of the approach to Chinese identity has its historical origin. As mentioned, ethnic essentialism emphasized the blood connection among all Chinese people in order to include all ethnic groups, including the Han group and Chinese ethnic minorities, in the notion of the Chinese nation, it's called 中华民族. And this component starts by connecting Chinese identity with Peking, who is considered as the ancestor of all Chinese people. The relationship between Peking and being Chinese was first documented at the end of the 19th century. Since then, the narrative of Peking and prehistoric China is used to reinforce the idea that Chinese identity is an organic entity with an uninterrupted line of descent which can be traced back to Peking. This serves to stress the unique antiquity and generic homogeneity of the Chinese. And ethnic essentialism started to have intense political implications, especially closely connected with nationalism since the 20th century. This component focuses on the apparent de facto aspects of Chinese identity that are pure to people's birth, with people unable to freely choose them. And from my data collection, I found that in government documents, around 63% of relevant documents in China and 52% in Hong Kong contain this component. In general, the governments promote a notion of a community of the Chinese nation which share blood. In this broad notion of the Chinese nation, people of Chinese descent, no matter where they are born and live, or how weak their connections are with China, such as they cannot speak Chinese and do not support socialism, they will be counted as Chinese. They are also considered in this notion as sharing the same blood with other members of the nation and cannot get rid of their responsibilities to China's development. Although both the Chinese and Hong Kong governments emphasize blood ties, they have differences, especially in terms of the degree of emphasis and focal points. The Chinese government overtly and systematically promotes a unified Chinese ethnicity that covers all Chinese ethnic groups. At the same time, it puts more emphasis on developing a bigger picture of the Chinese nation that contains all ethnic Chinese at home and abroad. But in Hong Kong, the government promotes ethnic essentialism more covertly and less systematically. It specifically focuses on shared blood ties between people in mainland China and Hong Kong. And in textbooks, a similar proportion of pages of relevant textbooks promote this component of understanding Chinese identity. In general, textbooks in both societies frame Chinese people as having an uninterrupted line of descent, which can be traced back to some common ancestors of the Chinese nation, such as Peking Man and the Yellow Emperor. Then they use this to warrant the notion of the Chinese nation. But as mentioned, they also have different focal points. Textbooks in China put more emphasis on 56 ethnic groups in China in developing a big family of the Chinese nation connected by blood. So they also mention overseas Chinese. By comparison, textbooks in Hong Kong especially focus on the shared blood ties between people in China and Hong Kong. And the relationship between 56 ethnic groups in China are not emphasized. In this book, I argue that this component doesn't only exist in Chinese societies. If you look into the global situation, you will see that governments across various societies, including the United States, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Japan, and South Korea, have also been identified as promoting ethnic stereotypes and other essentialist thinking that ethnicity cannot change. This essentialist way of thinking often connects with the definition of the authentic American, British, Japanese, or Korean. For example, ethnic Chinese and Japanese people are often perceived as forever foreigners and find it hard to be accepted as authentically American or British. Of course, ethnic essentialism doesn't have to be bad. However, in certain circumstances, it is understood. If it is understood and promoted in a narrow-minded way, then it will have negative impacts. This is often seen in the cases where aspects of ethnicity are seen as fixed and permanent, because these aspects become exclusive and close to outsiders. The essentialist idea that people who share specific ethnic characteristics, race, kinship, blood, or ancestry should identify with and support each other is used to arouse ethnic conflict and validate in-group enmity and out-group enmity. Moreover, when ethnic essentialism is understood and promoted in a narrow-minded way, it neglects diversity within groups and doesn't respect people as self-determined autonomous individuals. The next component is cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation is often defined as a process whereby individuals or groups from different cultural backgrounds change their original cultures and adopt the dominant cultures of society. This measure by the enhancement of one's competence in the mainstream culture and the decline of one's connection of their primary culture. And cultural assimilation in Chinese society starts from a discourse that emphasizes that universal Chinese culture transcends geographical boundaries and can be acquired by outsiders. This discourse then develops into a notion of Chinese culture shared by all Chinese people and some non-Chinese people, which assumes a sense of superiority of Chinese culture and the legitimacy of cultural assimilation. Here, Chinese culture is understood in a vague way that covers all cultures created by the Han and Chinese ethnic minorities, with the assumption of the superiority of the Han culture. This understanding goes hand in hand with ethnic essentialism because it also assumes all ethnic Chinese people share the same culture. Again, this component also has its historical origin. Governments at different eras in Chinese history recognize the constraints of the ethnographical shaping of the Chinese as a group of inhabitants of a geographical region. They have proposed cultural assimilation to include people outside the original geographical region. Cultural assimilation starts with the discourse of Chinese civilization, which emphasizes a universal Chinese culture that transcends boundaries and can be acquired by outsiders. This discourse indicates that being Chinese means that one plays by the rules of the dominant Chinese culture. With the assumption of the superiority of the Chinese culture, such as it is civilized, it persists that anyone who adopts the culture is Chinese and superior to those who do not adopt the culture, non-Chinese. In this sense, Chinese assimilation supports absorption of outsiders and sees expansion of China through transformation or assimilation of non-Chinese as a natural state of affairs. Following this logic, cultural assimilation creates and it reinforces a distinction between civilization and barbarianism. In this world order, China and the Chinese people were in the center. The Chinese culture was considered as the most civilized and was adored by outsiders. Throughout Chinese history, cultural assimilation connected closely with the idea of harmony. And harmony is often seen as the ultimate goal that cultural assimilation aims to achieve. And in the data that I collected back to 3 years ago, I found that over 37% of relevant government documents in China and 32% in Hong Kong contain content that promotes cultural assimilation and the idea of cultural homogeneity. Differences between the Chinese and Hong Kong governments lie in their focal points and targeted ethnic minority groups. The Chinese government creates a broader notion of the community of the Chinese nation with shared Chinese culture. But the Hong Kong government focuses more on highlighting the shared cultural ties between Hong Kong and China. And the manifestations in textbooks also indicate a similar picture. In Hong Kong, 54% contain more content regarding cultural assimilation than in China, wherein there is a proportion of 31%. In general, textbook in the two societies both promote a sense of cultural superiority and a Han-dominant Chinese culture shared by all members of the Chinese nation. Yet, they also have different focal points. That is, textbooks in China put more emphasis on developing a shared Chinese culture among all members of the Chinese nation. In comparison, textbooks in Hong Kong focus more on the cultural connection in Hong Kong and China. Because I don't have the time to go into the details, so if you want to know more about the detail, especially the extras from textbooks and from documents, you can refer to the book as a reference if you want to. And also, as like the previous component, in the book, I also argue that this component has global relevance. And beyond the two societies that are examined, cultural assimilation is practiced in many other contexts. And in those contexts, cultural assimilation can be voluntary or forced, and has different target groups, which often are indigenous people, ethnic minorities, or immigrants. And of course, people would say that cultural assimilation, sometimes it can be warranted in certain cases. For example, it is often found in certain cases to help newcomers, immigrants, and refugees more easily integrate into the host societies, become more accepted by the majority, and gain higher life satisfaction, social economic status, and a sense of belonging. In other cases, some people would argue that it is important and necessary for a nation or a society to have some cultural requirements for welcoming people from different cultural backgrounds, such as prioritizing a shared civic version. For example, if you want to live here, we ask that you share our culture. These are two cases where people often justify cultural assimilation. But in general, cultural assimilation has been criticized for promoting an unreachable idea with high costs. In particular, it creates an illusion that homogeneity among people is a normal and valuable condition, and that once people give up their minority cultures, they can be accepted and welcome as a part of the majority without prejudice or biased understandings. However, this fantasy of seamless integration for acceptance and equal status is hard, if not impossible, to achieve in reality. Even those who seek to assimilate into the mainstream culture often still face numerous challenges and barriers that are difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. such as differences in physical appearance, accent, and surname. As long as they are distinguishable from the mainstream culture, they will always experience racism, xenophobia, fears, and hatred in a society that expects and demands assimilation. Moreover, cultural assimilation warrants racism and other unequal and unjust ideas and practice that maintain and strengthen the privilege of mainstream cultures. Cultural assimilation implies a cultural hierarchy that culture-specific conceptions of the good by dominant groups in societies are better than those by minority groups. In many cases, this is a justification for using oppressive methods, as cultural minorities could not be expected to converge on such a conception through the free exercise of reason. In addition, critics also question the assumption that change is one-directional and that assimilation occurs in a straight line path, which equates assimilation with progress and advancement. Supporters of cultural assimilation, such as classical assimilationists, often see cultural assimilation as a natural process that has a relatively clear beginning and endpoint, and is unavoidable and largely unstoppable. According to this assumption, while majority groups also go through minor and often superficial changes, such as music types, adoption of foods, etc., most significant and fundamental changes are faced by minorities. In relation, minority cultures are seen as simply absorbed by the majority culture while having little or no contribution to it. However, in many cases, this assumption is not accurate. And the final major approach to Chinese history is nationalistic history. Here, I want to differentiate nationalistic history from national history. National history contributes to nation building. Ideally, learning national history can have positive effects. For example, at a national level, it helps a nation to unite people and develop solidarity and cohesion. Moreover, the collective history of a nation, if interpreted inclusively and collectively, can empower people with knowledge, skills, and values to help avoid bad history repeating itself and enhance societies in the future. And at an individual level, it could be helpful for people to develop a sense of belonging in terms of the shared past. However, nationalistic history is not equal to national history. It refers to the government's nationalistic interpretation of a nation's past, shared by all members of a nation. Nationalistic history connects the past, present, and future of a nation in a way that stirs up nationalistic sentiment. It is a selected and manipulated history that serves the interest of nationalists. In the context of Chinese identity, nationalistic history promotes a sense of shared sacredness through common historical experiences to bind all Chinese people. In this sense, this component connects with the previous components because it only reflects the perspectives of ethnic Chinese people who embrace the Han-dominant Chinese culture. Again, there's a historical origin of this component. You can see governments in different eras of China often use nationalistic histories and memories to form a Chinese identity that has a sense of timelessness and an unbroken continuity with the past. And in government documents, I found that over 37% of documents in China and 57% in Hong Kong use nationalistic history to understand Chinese identity. In general, both governments develop a sense of sacred history. However, they have different focal points and degrees of emphasis. The Chinese government puts more emphasis on attributing the current achievements of China to the leadership of the Communist Party of China and a shared future that all members of the nation should contribute to. In comparison, the Hong Kong government pays more attention to the historical connection and shared future between Hong Kong and China. In textbooks, 54% textbooks in China contain content regarding nationalistic history, while in Hong Kong only 23% contain the relevant content. In general, textbooks in China pay more equal attention to the glorious Asian past, the century of humiliation, present victories, and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Yet, textbooks in Hong Kong put more emphasis on highlighting the historical connection between Hong Kong and China, with a few pages mentioning the century of humiliation. The other two components are not mentioned in textbooks. And this component also has global relevance. You can see that using selected nationalistic histories or memories for understanding identity is a prevalent phenomenon across many countries, such as in the United States, France, Germany, South Africa, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. Relevant mediums of delivering nationalistic histories and memories are commemorative ceremonies and monuments, myths, rituals, heroes, textbooks, cinema, and media. And this nationalistic histories framework has raised global debates, especially regarding its limitations. Many people question that national history is controversial, including who writes national history, which version of historical narrative should be considered official, and how to interpret collective memories. They point out that in a nation, in addition to the nationalistic one, there are many competing interpretations of national history from different stakeholders. They often question and challenge the nationalistic narrative because they find it unjust, inaccurate, and exclusive. To overcome the limitations of the nationalistic narrative, they demand their perspective recognized, documented, and commemorated. With these challenges, the nationalistic history framework has been criticized for creating fictitious consensus and false collective memories of a group. According to this criticism, consensus and collective memories, especially traumatic memories, are dominant relatives and highly controversial. Historical error and deliberate forgetting are inevitable and even necessary in this ongoing process of forging collective memories. In this sense, national history misrepresents the situation in any diverse nation. In addition, a national history framework leaves the door open for politicians to revise or even control the narrative to serve their own interest, such as glorifying the past and warranting the present, maintaining and strengthening the current social structure, dividing the world and the nation, and arousing international conflicts. So, in this part, I will show why a multicultural approach could be an alternative option for both the societies. You can see Mainland China and Hong Kong, they are self-identified as multicultural societies where individuals have intersectional identities. They both formally consider multicultural aims, such as embracing and appreciating diversity, recognizing diverse identities and dialogue as core values and future goals. However, these multicultural aims could be endorsed nominally by the governments without the intention of truly practicing them in the societies every day. In fact, although the governments and textbooks in both societies take a multicultural orientation to identity at an abstract level, they do not specifically apply it in their understanding of Chinese identity. So in this book, I argue that a multicultural approach should be applied to understanding Chinese identity as an alternative to the current approach. In general, the multicultural understanding of Chinese identity, the approach that I propose here contains three main components. They are recognizing diverse aspects of Chinese identity, adding in more minority views, and encouraging co-construction of Chinese identity dialogue. And because of time limit, I don't come to argue in detail, but if you look into the book, you can find my arguments there. And some people would say that maybe the multicultural approach to Chinese identity is kind of rootless in both societies. But in my book, I use evidence from government documents and textbooks to show that this approach, in fact, it is not by no means rootless within both societies. Instead, show that government documents and textbooks, this approach matched with the governments and textbooks affirmation of multiculturalism and multicultural values. For example, around 16% of relevant government documents in China and over 27% in Hong Kong contain content that affirms multiculturalism and reflects a multicultural orientation to identity in general. At an abstract level, both governments recognize that the societies are de facto multicultural and consider many multicultural values as beneficial. Relevant textbooks in Hong Kong, 40% in particular, contain more content regarding a multicultural orientation than in mainland China in terms of the proportion of pages. So here are some final remarks. Because you can see that in Chinese societies, the official understanding of Chinese identity is pervasive. It ties to many aspects of Chinese people's everyday lives, such as how they should see themselves and their role in societies, how they should treat their compatriots, and what would happen if they betray their duties to the Chinese nation. And you can see that this Chinese identity issue is becoming intensively controversial in both societies today, is more and more relevant to people's everyday lives. So in this context, I found that the most updated, not the most updated till now, but till 2 years ago, official understanding of the Chinese and Hong Kong governments, they still follow the same old view of Chinese identity, denying heterogeneity among Chinese people and excluding many stakeholders, such as Chinese ethnic minorities and non-ethnic Chinese people, in the process of constructing Chinese identity. Although with slightly different focal points and degrees of emphasis, the government and textbooks in the two societies put special emphasis on three senses of Chinese identity: ethnicity, cultural, and national history, to construct a notion of a pan-Chinese nation. This nationalistic and narrow-minded approach to conceptualizing Chinese identity contradicts a multicultural orientation that the governments express elsewhere. And as I just talk about that, it reflects and leads to xenophobia, discrimination, assimilation, and a sense of superiority. So in this book, I argue that multiculturalism should be more meaningfully employed in understanding Chinese identity to overcome these negative effects. My proposal here, probably it could help develop a more inclusive and multicultural Chinese identity that recognize multiple aspects of Chinese identity, allows multiple ways of renouncing and gaining Chineseness, and invites diverse stakeholders into the process of co-developing identity. That's all of my presentation. Thank you very much.